The question seemed simple at first, but simplicity, when it concerns the machinery of war, often masks decades of silence. In the spring of 1944, while Soviet T-34 tanks were reshaping the Eastern Front and German panzers still cast their iron shadow across Europe, an American engineer named Dr. Edmund Matthews stood in a classified facility in Detroit and made a prediction that would haunt military archives for nearly 80 years. "We are building the machine that should have arrived 2 years ago. By the time it rolls onto the battlefield, the war will have already decided its own destiny." He was speaking about the M26 Pershing, a tank that would eventually be called the first true heavy tank of the American arsenal. But Matthews was not celebrating. He was mourning. The Pershing did not emerge from ambition alone. It emerged from necessity disguised as failure. For 3 years, American tankers had faced an uncomfortable truth. Their primary tank, the M4 Sherman, was outgunned by German armor. The 75mm gun of the Sherman could pierce enemy steel at short range, but German crews, sitting inside Tigers and Panthers, held the technological advantage. Countless reports filed from North Africa and Sicily described the same phenomenon. American crews dying in superior numbers to achieve inferior results. The War Department, however, moved slowly. Bureaucracy and inter-service rivalry strangled innovation. The Army ground forces believed the solution lay not in better tanks, but in better tactics and greater numbers. Armor could be compensated with artillery. Courage could substitute for engineering. For 2 years, this philosophy cost lives. Dr. Matthews had spent those 2 years in laboratories and production plants, watching the technical specifications for a heavier, better-armed tank pile-up on desks marked "Not Urgent." He had access to captured German armor reports. He understood the mathematics of ballistics and steel composition. He knew what was coming, and he knew America was not ready. The Pershing's gestation was unlike that of other American weapons. It was born not from a coherent strategic vision, but from accumulated frustration. Tank commanders in Europe sent desperate cables. Intelligence officers flagged the growing disparity. Finally, in late 1943, authorization came, not with celebration, but with the quiet acknowledgement of an error that had already cost blood. The specifications were ambitious: a 90mm main gun, thicker frontal armor, a more powerful engine. For the first time, an American tank would not simply be competitive with German armor, it would be superior. But there was a problem that no amount of engineering could solve: time. The machine that should have arrived in 1942 was now being rushed into production in 1944. And even then, it would not see serious combat until the European war was nearly finished. What happened to the first prototypes remains partially obscured. In April 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies closed in on Berlin from the east, a single M26 Pershing was reported lost during a training exercise near Grafenwehr, Germany. The official report, filed hastily and marked "classified," stated only that the tank had been disabled during a mechanical failure, and that recovery was not attempted due to operational constraints. The crews survived. The tank did not. For decades, this was merely a footnote in the vast archive of American military records. But in 1989, when certain classified documents began to be declassified, historians noticed something peculiar. The serial numbers did not match the inventory. The tank that was reported lost had never officially existed in the records. It was a phantom, or perhaps a deliberate erasure. Dr. Edmund Matthews died in 1962, having never spoken publicly about the Pershing project. His personal papers, donated to a university archive in Michigan, contain handwritten notes in the margins of technical drawings. One note, dated March 1945, reads simply, "They will claim it was the best. They will never admit what it replaced or why it was too late." The question of American tank supremacy, it seems, was not purely technical. It was also a question of memory, of what nations choose to celebrate and what they choose to forget. Now, we invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. Every weapon system carries within it a hidden calendar, a record of decisions made and postponed, of meetings where voices advocated for urgency and were overruled by voices that spoke of caution, efficiency, or simply the weight of military tradition. The M26 Pershing's calendar began not in 1944, when it received official authorization, but in 1941, when the first reports arrived from armored divisions in North Africa describing encounters with German Panzer III and full tanks. American officers observed something that contradicted their pre-war assumptions. Raw courage and superior numbers were not always sufficient when the enemy possessed superior engineering. Colonel John H. Christie, a legendary figure in American tank design, had been advocating for a heavier, better-armed tank since before the war began. Christie understood, with an almost prophetic clarity, that the future of armored warfare would belong not to those with the most tanks, but to those with the most lethal tanks. His designs were radical, visionary, and deeply unpopular with the Army Ground Forces hierarchy, which had committed itself to the doctrine of mass production and tactical mobility. A tank is not an instrument of precision, one senior general declared in a 1942 meeting. The words preserved in declassified records. It is an instrument of momentum. We will win with numbers, not with German engineering. The M4 Sherman became the embodiment of this philosophy. It was reliable, easy to produce, and could be replaced quickly when destroyed. From a logistical standpoint, it was brilliant. From the perspective of the young men who died inside it, penetrated by shells their own guns could not answer, the philosophy offered cold comfort. By 1943, the gap had become impossible to ignore. The Army Ground Forces formed the Special Committee on Tank Development, ostensibly to explore new designs. In reality, the committee became a bureaucratic graveyard where innovation went to be studied, debated, and ultimately delayed. Technical specifications were drawn up, revised, debated again. Should the new tank be 45 tons or 50 tons? Should it have a 76mm gun or a 90mm? Should it prioritize speed or armor? These were not idle questions. Each decision cascaded through factories, supply lines, and training protocols. A 90mm gun required different ammunition, different loading procedures, different crew training. The logistics of introducing a new standard in the middle of a global conflict were staggering. Military planners struggled with the paradox. The sooner they introduced the new tank, the sooner it would become operational, but the more disruption it would cause to existing supply chains and tactics. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Soviet engineers were solving the same problem with characteristic ruthlessness. The T-34, introduced in 1940, was continuously upgraded. By 1943, the Soviet IS-2 heavy tank had arrived, carrying a 122mm gun that could penetrate any armor fielded by the Western Allies. The Soviets, it seemed, understood something about the mathematics of warfare that American committees did not, that superiority itself is a weapon, and that technological stagnation is a form of defeat. Dr. Edmund Matthews wrote a classified memo in February 1944 that somehow survived into the declassified records. The enemy's heaviest tank, the IS-2, is not simply a weapon. It is a statement of intent. It announces that the Soviets believe they will survive this war and shape its outcome. Every month we delay in introducing a comparable American tank is a month during which we implicitly accept that we will not shape the outcome, only participate in it. The memo was marked "Received" by the Office of the Chief of Staff. There is no evidence that it was acted upon. The M26 Pershing, when it finally arrived, came with the weight of 3 years of delay built into its very structure. It was not simply a tank, it was a confession, an admission that American military planning had been, in some fundamental way, unprepared for the kind of war that technology and science had created. The 1st Battalion of Pershings did not see combat until February 1945, just 3 months before the German surrender. They arrived too late to reshape the course of the war. But they arrived in time to pose a question that would trouble military strategists for decades. How many lives was the price of institutional caution? If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. The motor pool at WWII was a place of mechanical certainty. Every tank in the pool had a designation, a serial number, a maintenance record that traced its history from the factory floor to the training ground. The men who worked there understood their responsibility. They were the custodians of machines that could decide whether soldiers lived or died. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was documented, until something was not. Sergeant William Kellerman supervised the maintenance depot from 1944 to 1946. In his personal diary, entries written in pencil and preserved in an archive at the Library of Congress, he recorded the routine details of his work. Tank rotations, maintenance schedules, parts requisitions. The entries are mundane, the language spare and technical. Then, in March 1945, the tone shifts. Tank 156-7 assigned this morning for trials, not on previous rosters, no maintenance history. Serial number does not match inventory lists I have access to. Ordered to begin diagnostics without delay. Crew assigned from 7th Army Tank Battalion did not recognize officer in charge. When I asked for documentation, told to complete work and not ask questions. This is not how we operate. Something is wrong with this machine, and I do not mean the engine. The diary entry continues. Tank ran hot, too hot. Engine temperatures exceeded normal parameters by significant margin. I noted overheating in the report. Was told by officer, Lieutenant Colonel, whose name was not provided, which is irregular, that the thermal signature was part of the test, and to record nothing unusual in the official maintenance log. I refused. He left. When I returned to the motor pool the next morning, the tank was gone. Kellerman's diary goes silent on the subject for 2 weeks. Then, on April 3rd, 1945, found out from talking to the 7th Army mechanics that the tank we were working on crashed into a ravine near WWII. Official story is mechanical failure during a training maneuver, but the crew is alive. If it were a true mechanical failure with that kind of impact, crew would not be alive. Something else happened. The machine was being tested for something other than what the records will show. What was Tank 156-7? For more than 40 years, the answer remained obscured by the fog of military bureaucracy and deliberate omission. Official Army records simply did not address it. The tank was not mentioned in any official after-action reports. It did not appear in casualty reports because there were no casualties. It did not appear in equipment loss tallies because it was not supposed to exist. It was not until 1989, when a military historian named Dr. Patricia Chen was researching the development of American heavy tank doctrine, that she discovered Sergeant Kellerman's diary in an archive and cross-referenced it with newly declassified documents. She found a memo dated April 10, 1945, from an Army Ordnance official to the War Department Special Projects Division. The memo was brief, composed in dense military bureaucratic language. Recovery of Unit 156-7 not feasible. Recovery effort would draw attention to classified testing parameters. Recommend unit be listed as operational loss due to mechanical failure. Crew debriefing to be conducted under security protocols. Recommend no documentation of this event be filed in standard equipment loss channels. Unit 156-7 was the 14th M26 Pershing to be produced. It was not a standard tank. According to declassified Army ordnance files, it was a test platform for an experimental gun system, a modified 90mm cannon with enhanced ballistic characteristics, designed to test the theoretical limits of anti-armor penetration. The test was classified because it was being conducted under a secret agreement with the Soviet Union. This is the part of the story that military archives still struggle to fully acknowledge. In early 1945, with the war in Europe winding down, but the war in the Pacific still raging, American military planners were already thinking about the post-war world. They understood that Soviet armor would dominate Europe after the German defeat. They also understood that they might, eventually, face Soviet armor in combat. The tests being conducted on Tank 156-7 were not about defeating Germany. They were about preparing for a conflict that might never be formally declared, but that military strategists knew was coming. The experimental gun system worked too well. In simulated firing tests conducted in closed ranges, it penetrated armor plate at distances and angles that surprised even the designers. The implications were clear. American engineers had cracked a problem that would define the next decade of tank warfare. They had achieved the supremacy they sought. But demonstrating that supremacy to the wrong people, or even accidentally revealing its existence, could alter the delicate negotiations that were already beginning between the Allies about the post-war order. So the tank that proved American technical genius was destroyed. The crew was debriefed in secret. Sergeant Kellerman was eventually reassigned, far from the motor pools of Europe. And Tank 156-7 entered the realm of things that officially never happened. The ravine near Grafenwehr, where the tank was abandoned, was filled in after the war. The metal was never salvaged. And the question that Sergeant Kellerman had written in his diary, "Something is wrong with this machine," was never answered because the machine itself was erased from the historical record. Until now. In 1998, when Dr. Patricia Chen published her findings in a military history journal, she received an unexpected letter. It was postmarked from a small town in Oregon. The sender identified himself only as former officer, Ordnance Corps, 7th Army. The letter contained 7 pages, handwritten in careful, deliberate script. "I have read your article," the letter began. "You are correct about the tank, but you have not understood the full truth about what was being tested. I was there. I saw what the gun system could do, and I have spent 50 years trying to decide whether I was part of history or part of a crime." The letter did not provide a name, but it provided details that only someone with direct involvement could have known. It described the firing tests in technical language that suggested an engineering background. It described the decision to destroy the tank as though recounting a personal moment of moral failure. And it posed a question that seemed to haunt the writer across the decades. When a nation discovers that it possesses a weapon more powerful than it had believed possible, what is its obligation? To use that knowledge, to hide it, to weaponize it in secret, knowing that the enemy will eventually discover it anyway. I chose to hide it. I followed orders. I told myself that I was serving my country. But what if serving your country means betraying the future? The letter was never definitively authenticated. The sender never revealed himself. Dr. Chen kept the letter confidential for years, honoring what she perceived as the writer's wish for anonymity. But the existence of the letter changed the historical narrative. It transformed Tank 156-7 from a bureaucratic footnote into a moral testimony. What the anonymous officer seemed to be describing was not simply a technical test, but a moment of choice. the moment at which a nation could have decided to reveal its advantage or conceal it. The choice to conceal it shaped everything that followed. The Cold War arms race, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the assumption on both sides that each nation held secrets that could tip the balance. In 2003, through Freedom of Information Act requests and declassified documents, researchers gained access to a file marked Special Testing Programs, ETO, 1944-1945. Among the documents was a list of the M26 Pershings that had been produced, with their serial numbers and fates. Tank 156-7 was listed with a single notation. Experimental platform. Testing terminated April 1945. Unit disposition. Destroyed in training accident. No further action. But there was an addendum added by hand in 1989, presumably by someone in the Army's Historical Office. Actual disposition unknown. Unit may have been intentionally destroyed to conceal classified testing parameters. Recommend further investigation when classification restrictions are lifted. The recommendation was never acted upon. Sergeant William Kellerman died in 1967. His diary was donated to the Library of Congress by his family, who did not fully understand its historical significance. Dr. Edmund Matthews died in 1962, his role in the Pershing Project known only to a small circle of colleagues and military officials. The anonymous officer who wrote the letter in 1998 never came forward. His identity remains unknown. What survives is the testimony of silence, the gap between what was recorded and what actually happened, between what was declassified and what remained hidden, between the official history and the lived experience of those who carried the burden of knowing. Tank 156-7 became what Dr. Patricia Chen would later call the most powerful tank that never existed. Powerful because it shaped the trajectory of weapons development for decades after the war. Powerful because its secret test proved that American engineering could surpass even German sophistication, and powerful precisely because it was erased from public memory. The M26 Pershing would be celebrated as the king of the battlefield, but only in retrospective analyses written after the war. The tank that truly proved American supremacy, the one that arrived too late to matter and was destroyed to keep its secrets, was forgotten by everyone except those who were there, and they were bound by obligation and fear to say nothing. Wars end, but the questions they leave behind persist. In 2019, an American documentary filmmaker obtained access to newly declassified photographs from the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Among thousands of images catalogued and filed away for 70 years were 6 photographs from April 1945, taken at Grafenwehr. They showed a tank, clearly an M26 Pershing based on its profile, positioned in a testing ground, and in the final photograph, the same tank being hauled away on a recovery vehicle, its gun barrel severed cleanly at the muzzle. Why cut the barrel? The explanation that emerged from military historians was immediate and technical. Easier to transport a gun without its barrel. The pieces could be separated and disposed of separately. But those who understood the symbolism saw something else. The deliberate destruction of the weapon itself, not simply its removal. The gun that had proven too powerful was being unmade, piece by piece. The question of who was the real king of the battlefield can now be answered with precision. It was the tank that no one was allowed to know existed. It was the M26 Pershing, designated as Tank 156-7, tested in secret and destroyed to preserve the uncertainty upon which military deterrence rests. American tank doctrine after World War II was built on a peculiar foundation: the assumption that the Soviets possessed capabilities that American strategists understood in only partial terms. The Soviets, meanwhile, operated under the same assumption about American capabilities. This mutual uncertainty, paradoxically, created stability. It prevented either side from believing it held an absolute advantage. But that stability rested on erasure. It rested on tanks that were destroyed rather than studied, on test results that were filed in classified vaults, on men like Sergeant Kellerman and the anonymous officer who were bound by oath to carry their knowledge to the grave. Dr. Edmund Matthews, the engineer who had predicted that the Pershing would arrive too late, ended his career not as a celebrated innovator, but as a consultant to the Department of Defense, helping design the specifications for the next generation of American tanks. He attended no public ceremonies. He received no honors. His contribution to American military technology was acknowledged only in classified citations that would not be declassified until decades after his death. When he died in 1962, his obituary in the New York Times mentioned only his work on unspecified military projects. The depth of his insight that American armor doctrine was being shaped by institutional caution rather than technical vision was never publicly recorded. It remained a private burden, carried until the end. The ravine near Grafenwehr, where Tank 156-7 was abandoned, was eventually developed. Buildings were constructed. The earth was moved. Whatever traces remained of the tank, fragments of metal, hydraulic fluid, rubber from the treads, were buried beneath decades of German rebuilding and European progress. The physical evidence was erased as it had been intended to be, but the historical record, once disturbed, cannot be fully repaired. The gaps in the documentation became themselves a form of evidence. The missing serial numbers, the unofficial crew assignments, the officer who left no name. These silences testify to something that happened, something that was intentionally obscured, something that still shapes how nations think about armor, superiority, and the moral calculus of military advantage. The M26 Pershing was eventually recognized as a superior tank, but that recognition came only after the war, only in historical analysis, only when it no longer mattered tactically. The Pershing that was celebrated in post-war assessments was the visible one, the tank that arrived too late and fought in limited actions. The true king of the battlefield was the one that proved the doctrine was possible, was tested in secret, and was destroyed to prevent that knowledge from altering the balance of power. In the end, the most powerful tank was not the one that fired the most devastating shells or carried the thickest armor. It was the one that was never acknowledged, the machine that existed at the intersection of military necessity and historical amnesia. The war ended in 1945, but the silence around what was truly possible, around what American engineering had achieved, persisted for decades. That silence was not the absence of history. It was history itself, written in erasure and strategic forgetting, spoken in the language of what was never said. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.